Hi everyone, Joseph Koenskin here. Today I want to show you how I prepare the boards that I use for my acrylic paintings. Now I've got my piece here. This is called Hardboard, and you can get this at most hardware stores, and it usually comes in large 4x8 sheets. You can sometimes find smaller cut pieces that are 4x4 or 2x4 as well. It usually comes in two thicknesses, 1/8 inch thick and 1/4 inch. I've got the 1/4 inch here, and I prefer the 1/4 inch because it has less chance of warping, especially once you get up into larger and larger sized paintings. Before I get started, let me show you some of the things I'm going to be using today. I've got a golden gloss medium. I've got a 2-inch brush for the gloss medium. I've got acrylic gesso. I've got 6-inch putty knives, which I'm going to use to apply the gesso. And then I've got some sandpapers, which I'm going to use for the final finishing to get that smooth surface. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get my board cut down to the right size. You can usually get this done at the hardware store where you got the wood. I'm going to do it here at home, and I'm going to measure it out very precisely. This board is going to be 12 inches by 20 inches. I just want to make sure that this line is nice and straight, so that when I make my cut, all my corners are nice and square to each other. Then I can sand off some of those rough spots, especially where I made my cut, if there's any loose pieces hanging off. I just want to smooth out all the edges. This will make it easier for sealing and priming. Once I've got my board cut, I want to seal it on all sides with my gloss medium. So I'm going to use the Golden Gloss Medium today. There's also another product out there from Golden called GAC 100, which is also meant for sealing any kind of surface that you're going to be painting on. The wood is quite porous, and so the first layer is going to get absorbed into the wood when you first put it on. So it's recommended to do 2 layers. I like to do 3 just to make sure that there is that nice seal between the board and the gesso. I usually like to give it at least 30 to 45 minutes to dry before I flip it over and I do the other side. And I want to alternate doing one side and the other to prevent it from warping. This is going to be especially important on larger pieces of board where warping can potentially be a factor. And then as well, it's important to do the edges because we want to make sure that it's sealed on all sides from moisture. Now that my first layer is dry, I'm going to apply 2 more coats to all sides to make sure we've got a really great seal. The goal with the gloss medium or the GAC 100 is to create a layer of acrylic polymer between our board and our primer. This is going to do 2 important things. It's going to keep moisture out of the board, which could cause it to warp or rot. As well, it's going to prevent something called support-induced discoloration, or SID for short. This is where you get colors or potential contaminants leaching up from the board into our base and into our paint, discoloring our painting over time. So this acrylic polymer layer is going to really prevent that from happening. Now that I've got my layers of the gloss medium on my board, I'm going to start with my gesso, and today I'm using the Liquitex Professional Acrylic Gesso. It goes on nice and smooth, and when it's dry and sanded, it has a really nice tooth for holding on to the paint. You can also get the gesso in much larger quantities like this 1-gallon pail, which is perfect for much larger paintings where you're covering a ton of surface area. So I'm just going to pour a little bit on for my first layer on the one side. And then I'm going to use my 6-inch putty knife to spread it around. Now the reason I use this instead of a paintbrush is because I don't want any texture in my final finished surface. And using this putty knife like this allows me to get a much smoother surface early on without having to sand out lots of brush marks in the end. Now, this is entirely personal preference. If you want a little bit of texture in your gesso, by all means use a brush. You can cross hatch, you can go in different directions to create more interesting patterns. But for me personally, I like an ultra smooth finish, and this helps cut down on my sanding time, and I use way less sandpaper in the end because I only have to smooth out a few different marks. So I want to add quite a few more layers of gesso than potentially is recommended. So I'm probably going to do about 5 or 6 layers. And the reason I want to do this is just to make sure that I have that extra barrier between my board and my paint. As well, because when I'm sanding this later, I want to make sure that there's enough gesso there that I don't sand through all the layers down onto the board, having to start over again. And it's important that between each layer, you allow at least a day for it to dry. I have been able to get away with applying 2 coats of gesso per day, but the recommendation is to leave at least 24 hours between coats for it to dry. This will also help keep it from warping. If there's too much gesso on there trying to dry all at once, you run the risk of your board slightly bending or warping in different places. Now that my board is primed, I'm ready to sand it smooth. Now, I would recommend waiting at least a few days for the gesso to fully dry. I like to wait about a week before sanding, and then I find it sands really smooth and really evenly. So let's take this out to the garage and start sanding. So I'm going to start with a 120 grit sandpaper. And so I'm just going to use smooth circular motions with my electric sander. I'm not going to press very hard at all because I don't want the sander to dig too deeply into the gesso. I just want to take off that top layer where there's going to be some ridges and maybe a couple of little bumps and dents that got in there while I was applying the gesso. And then an important thing to do here is I want to sand the edges. Sometimes you get some drips over the side, and I just want to sand those off. All right, now that I've got it to a place that I like it, where it's nice and smooth, I just want to take my hand sander. I want to bevel the edges at about a 45-degree angle. And I'm just going to do it very slight just on the edge here. And this is a very important step. In the past, my edges would chip slightly, even when I was just working on it and handling the painting and bringing it around. And I've found that doing this little bevel, just taking away that harsh edge on the sides, really helped prevent chipping. Now that I've got my board sanded, I'm going to do my final step, which is a very light wet sanding. So I'm going to use a 600 grit sandpaper that's meant for wet sanding. I'm just going to get a little bit of warm water. And I'm going to dip my sandpaper into the warm water, not getting it too wet. And then I'll just lightly sand all areas of the painting. And as I sand each little section, I'm going to wipe away that excess moisture right away, just so the water doesn't soak into the gesso too much. The gesso is quite absorbent, and it will have a tendency to want to soak up that water if you leave it on there for too long. Now, this is not a necessary step. You don't have to do this part. It depends on how smooth you want your surface to be. With any type of sanding that I use with the electric sander or my hand sander, it does leave little marks and swirl patterns in the board. And so, because I paint quite thin, these little swirl marks did have a tendency to show through my paint. And what I want is just the texture of the paint and the brush marks that I make while I'm painting. And you can see the difference here from this little section that I've sanded to this other section that's now very smooth without any marks, and then the other part where you can still see some of those swirl marks left by my electric sander. All right, there we have it. I've got my board primed and sanded and ready for my next painting. All right, some final information that I'd like to share with you are some of the pros and cons when it comes to painting on your hardboard. And this is just through some of my experience that I've had over the years of painting that I've done. So I'll start with the pros. Firstly, this is a very sturdy surface to paint on. I like to paint very quickly and sometimes with a lot of pressure, and this surface can really handle that. It doesn't flex while you're painting it, and it doesn't have that springiness. It's very sturdy for being handled a lot while you're working on your painting. Next, the smooth surface that you can create with this is very good for detailed realism work, like the type of painting that I like to do. It means you can get really strong, sharp lines without them being broken up by any kind of texture that's on your painting surface. As a bit of a subpoint to this, you do have a lot of control over the texture that you want on your board. You can go from a very textured surface by adding something like modeling paste or a gel medium to your gesso, or all the way to ultra smooth and ultra flat like how I prefer to have it here. Next is that you can cut any custom size you want from your large 4x8 sheet. For my process, I really like to let my composition and the idea that I have for my painting really determine the size of board that I'm going to cut. The dimensions, the aspect ratio, and the size of the painting really are important parts to my creative process and the impact that I want my painting to have when it's finished. So the final one is that the cost per board is going to be relatively low. It only took a couple dollars worth of the gloss medium, a few dollars worth of the gesso, and the piece of board that I cut from that large 4x8 sheet was less than $2 for this size of board. So the relative cost of this is very low. All right, now for the cons to using this type of board for your painting. And the first one is probably the most obvious, as with this instructional video, is that the process is quite time consuming. And so from start to finish, from when you cut your board to sealing it, priming it, and sanding it, can be anywhere from a week or two versus going to the store and purchasing a pre-primed and stretched canvas, which you can use right away. So this process is quite time consuming, but I've just added it to my daily routine. If I've got a lot of boards to prep, I just prime the ones first thing, and then they can sit for a day, and I can do the same thing the following day until they're all finished. The next one is that these boards can become quite heavy once you start getting up into larger and larger sizes, especially like this 6-foot wide piece of board that I have cut ready for a painting that I'm going to do next year. So that is something to keep in mind, that as you get into larger and larger sizes, they can be a lot heavier than, say, a canvas of the same size. Another thing is that the edges and the corners can be a little bit more delicate than some of the other things you might paint on, like canvas or canvas boards. And so you just want to be careful while you're painting to be mindful of your edges and mindful of your corners. This is also why I did that thing before where I beveled the edges to help in preventing any damage or chipping that can occur on the edges and the corners. All right, so the last thing, which isn't necessarily a pro or a con, but certainly something that you want to keep in mind when you're choosing your painting surface, is that you will need to add some kind of custom framing or some kind of mounting to the back to either attach your wire or your hooks for hanging your painting on the wall. My personal preference is that I like to have my work in custom framing, so even if I were to paint on canvas, I would still like to put my paintings in a frame. That really does come down to personal preference, but it is something to keep in mind when you're choosing your painting surface, because there will be added cost and added time to the final painting. All right, there we have it. That is my process for how I prepare my hardboard for my acrylic paintings. Now, if you have anything you'd like to share or potentially something I might have missed, please leave it in the comments below. I think it's great when we can all learn from each other and continually grow as artists in this great artist community. So I appreciate you following along. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.